be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the first part of, What If Issei, Rias meet DanMachi. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of Totallynotsnipez on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. I gasped in panic as my eyes snapped open to be greeted in an unfamiliar room. My entire body felt like it had been set ablaze in pain, and I tumbled out of the unfamiliar king-sized bed I definitely hadn't fallen asleep in. With a quick cursory glance at my surroundings, I observed the luxurious bedroom that seemed fit for a king before doubling over in pain. This certainly wasn't my room. The painting on the wall looked expensive enough to put me in debt for a few generations itself. I had no clue what was happening. I grasped at my throat as it started to burn up, only to notice my small hands. These weren't my hands. What in God OW, what the F? The sharp stabbing sensations that were sent through my head caught me off guard. Specifically, my eyes began to burn. Had I been kidnapped? Probably, my luck was just that SHT. I couldn't even think properly, as my mind felt disoriented. My teeth were gritted as the pain only increased. Everything in my vision began to get blurry and I only had time to look up at a mirror to see a young crimson-haired teen with bright blue eyes staring back at me before I doubled over in pain. A glance up, and I noticed my eyes, which were now apparently a clear blue, now changing. My pupils dilated as a swirling nebula of colors suddenly swirled out from the center of my eyes. I didn't even get a chance to voice the sheer incredulously I felt as memories, not my own, began flooding into me. It was like watching a film as a life that wasn't mine briefly played. By the end of it, I had to admit I had no clue how to feel about this whole situation. The fact I was in another world was probably the biggest shock factor, or perhaps it was the fact I was a pure BLD devil. I was Zephyrion Gremory, the youngest child of the Gremory family. I have two older sisters, Serena Lucifer, who is one of the four Satans and the eldest, along with Rias Gremory, who was a few years older than me. I had an entire new life, with many friends from the devil's school I apparently went to and parents who adored me more than anyone from my previous life could ever hope to. It was certainly a weird experience. The fact that in my other life, I knew that most of these people were from a fictional world. Excluding the fact my elder sister was a gender-bent version of Surzek Lucifer, it was pretty much the same. I found myself utterly perplexed and baffled, still half wondering if I had somehow stumbled into some bizarre lucid dream. Unfortunately, I couldn't ponder for much longer, as my eyes started glowing, and I glanced back up into the mirror. I gawked at the change my eyes had gone through. My vision sharpened as I was left with a pair of multicolored orbs. Iridescent eyes that had a blend of golden and purple with pink in the middle. Contrary to the description that made it sound like they would be an ugly amalgamation of blended colors that didn't mix well, that couldn't have been further from the truth. It was as if someone had trapped rainbows in my eyes, and frankly, they were appealing. They looked much more unique than the green eyes I had in my previous life and the clear sky blue ones I had previously in this body. The shock of the new change to my eyes made me almost ignore the tug that I felt in my stomach, and I could only look in confusion as cracks in the air began surrounding my form. I vaguely began to hear a frantic knocking coming from what I now knew was my bedroom door, but oddly enough didn't care as I stared at the cracks in fascination. The knocks faded into the background as I felt drunk on something. It was difficult to explain. I couldn't think much as my mind became blurry, and as if a mirror had been broken, reality broke away to reveal a kaleidoscope of colors. I couldn't even muster up any resistance as my body was instantly sucked into the portal of swirling colors and my vision darkened as I quickly lost consciousness. Scene break. Regaining consciousness, I groaned as I noticed I was lying sprawled across the ground. Blinking blearily, I propped myself up with my arms and looked around confused. Waking up on the ground proved far from pleasant. I briefly entertained the notion that it might all have been an elaborate dream. Alas, reality struck as I still found myself still inhabiting the body of Zephyraion Gremory. I was still stuck with all these memories of another life packed into my head. I rubbed my eyes as I stared around where I had suddenly found myself. Surrounded by a vibrant lush forest which was teeming with life, it almost seemed to preen with nature. The trees and grass were all filled with life. Birds flying around happily. This place looked too good to be true. The only sign of human existence in sight was the colossal walls in the distance along with the colossal tower which seemed to be on a mission to leave Earth. I didn't know what to think at the moment. One moment I was sitting at home, only to be reborn into Zephyraion Gremory. Now I was waking up in a random forest, still just as confused. Swiftly collecting my thoughts, I gathered myself and calmed myself down with a sigh. There was no use obsessing over it. I had always been good at adapting to bad situations, and I saw no reason to alter that strategy now. I looked at the massive wall that seemingly stretched on for miles. I guess that's a good starting point. Getting up, I pat myself down and went to put my hands into my pockets, only to find I had none. Looking down at my current state of dress, I nodded and let out a depressed sigh. Right, noble devil clothing. I was currently in what essentially was my pajamas. Deciding not to dwell on it, I was thankful that pureblood devils appeared to wear what could amount to a simple red shirt and pants for bedtime. At least I didn't have to walk around wearing a nightie in midday. With that, I began walking towards the large wall stretching out. It took me a while to walk around to find an actual entrance. A large brick road filled with people lining up finally entered my vision. I noticed the guards at the gate, which led to a city inside the wall. There was a man with a clipboard signing people in. Getting a glimpse inside the enormous city inside the walls, I saw what seemed to be a massive tower that spiraled up to the heavens in the distance. Okay, where the F had I ended up? There was only so much SHT I could and was willing to take in a single day. With a sigh of resignation, I ran a hand through my blonde, crimson hair now before shrugging helplessly and casually strolling around to join the line. It took an entire 2 hours of waiting before I finally reached the front of the annoyingly long line of people waiting to enter. During that time, a single unmistakable detail was brought to my attention. It was the elf standing right in front of me. It drew my attention to the multitude of races lining up alongside me. I was starting to wonder if I was even in the world of DxD anymore. Excuse me. I was snapped out of my thoughts by a hand waving in front of me. I must have zoned out. Hello, I replied with a bit of uncertainty. Name? The man in front of me asked boredly. Zephyraion, I replied. He raised an eyebrow at my unique-sounding name, and I gave him an uncaring glance. I noticed his eyes linger on mine, which was fair since they were pretty weird. Surname? He lazily continued while writing on his board. Gremory, I replied evenly. Age? He ticked something off. 15. I winced as he gave me a dry look. Purpose of entry? He droned on. He sounded bored out of his mind. Seeking residence? I half-asked. He rolled his eyes and wrote something down. Alright, welcome to Orario. Try not to cause too much trouble during your stay. He spoke his clearly rehearsed lines. Wait, Orario. Where had I heard of that before? It was ringing some bells. Nodding in understanding, I walked past him. The guards sitting around and chatting didn't even bat an eye at my entry. Hold on. I paused, my gaze fixated on the woman with wolf ears walking past me. Suddenly, it clicked, Orario. Gods, dungeons, monsters. SHT. I somehow ended up in DanMachi. Serafall POV. The Underworld was currently in an uproar. Devils were being sent out in droves to scour the entirety of the Underworld. Every single one of the 4 Satan's peerages had been mobilized, and even the common devil was on the lookout. Zephyraion Gremory has gone missing. This news was massive and had spread to every corner of the Underworld. The fact it was a pillar devil was one thing, but also the fact he was the younger brother of Serena Lucifer made it much more important. A mere half an hour after the news had been released, a 10 million Ria, which was the devil's currency, had been offered for the safe return of Zephyraion. With an additional 5 million Ria offered for any information leading to his whereabouts. Serafall Leviathan currently strode down the large corridor with a purpose. The normally cheerful aura dissipated as a frosty aura of malice surrounded her. She was not in the mood to keep up the act. She was currently making her way to the meeting room of the 4 Satans, where her 3 friends awaited her arrival. Frost covered the windows, and she walked past the cowering devil servants. The reason she was so angry? She had been the one to discover Zephyrion's disappearance. Serafall had been going to try to coerce her cute, Zeph Tan, into making an appearance on her show for the 100th time this week, only to feel a large mass of demonic energy gathering in his room. Zephyraion had been told many times not to practice magic alone, since an unpracticed magic user with his amount of mana could easily cause damage to both himself and his surroundings without proper guidance. She had, of course, been concerned, especially when she sensed the sheer amount of power fluctuating from within his room. Which now made her wish she hadn't been polite and simply knocked. In her defense, Zephyraion was an introverted boy who liked his privacy. As much as she loved to tease him and jump all over him when he hung out with her, Serafall had always respected his privacy. Now though, when she had felt the mana dissipate and the silence inside the room, she had been worried Zephyraion had somehow hurt himself. With that thought, she had kicked down his magically reinforced door, expecting to see the annoyed face of Zephyraion as she invaded his privacy, only to be met with nothing. Serafall had frozen as she entered his room, finding it empty. Walking around in confusion, she discovered a pool of blood and what appeared to be vomit beside his bed. She lost track of time, simply staring as her mind gradually pieced together its own interpretation of the events that had transpired. The result was ugly. Her mind slowly ran over the worst outcomes before she snapped into action. Multiple detection spells were cast in a split second as she performed a large-scale scan for any sign of Zephyraion. A pulse of thick demonic energy pulsing out across the whole mansion, searching for him, akin to a radar. Nothing came up, and she had immediately informed everyone she could of the missing Zephyraion. Her peerage members and Serenas had been sent out in under 5 minutes of the discovery. Ajuka had been immediately called to the scene, as she didn't bother sparing any pleasantries and ran a thorough investigation of Zephyrion's room. Serafall had been while joining the search with a spectrum of emotions following through her. She and Zephyraion were closer than one might expect from a lady of her position. She had been utterly enthralled by the adorable crimson-haired boy when she first encountered him. In contrast to Sona, who often appeared embarrassed and frustrated to even be seen with her, much to Serafall's concealed sadness, Zephyraion had always been there for her, even if he remained unaware of it and the depth of her attachment to him. She had long accepted Sona's apparent dislike of her after a harsh reality check when she had been especially depressed after the 200th year anniversary on the day her best friend had died. Seeking comfort, she had naturally gone to Sona, her beloved little sister, only to be shoved away. As Sona had been with some other pureblood heiress and didn't wish to be embarrassed by her. Depressed and feeling especially lonely, she had stumbled into Zephyraion, who had been visiting the Citri Manor with Rias. Only he had snuck away from her after getting bored. He being the ever-silent but smart boy, he had instantly noticed she seemed down and, unlike her uncaring little sister, spent time comforting her. That had begun the start of a close friendship between the two. Now Seraphol had to walk and tell her fellow Satans that she had unknowingly let Zephyrion be abducted. The feeling of helplessness as she failed another person she held dear was heartbreaking, and it was only her determination that stopped her from fully releasing her emotions. She would find him. Zephyrion POV. I was currently sitting on a bench outside the massive spiraling tower as I observed the many adventure parties going in and out of the dungeon. Some came out injured, while others had massive grins in their faces, lugging giant bags with them. I hadn't run into anyone I knew from DanMachi, but that was to be expected since I had only been in Orario for an hour. There had been hundreds of parties in that hour that kept venturing into the dungeon. It showed me just how many people there were who went to explore the dungeon. You'd think the threat of being chomped down by some monsters would make the profession rarer. Turns out, people living in fantasy worlds didn't have the same mindset. Orario was a massive city, much larger than I had imagined it to be. I didn't really have anything planned at the moment, which led me to simply explore the city. The various shops selling potions and clothing were pretty fun to browse. The most practical course of action would likely be to join a familia, considering that people who didn't join one tended to be weak. Plus, who wouldn't want to become what was essentially a superhuman? I think part of it was my new devil instincts, which made me feel greed at the free power-up it would give. I guess I could think about that later. For now, I wanted to go see this guild that effectively controlled the dungeon and all the adventurers in Orario. I would probably register for access to the dungeon, since who wouldn't want to fight monsters? Now maybe one of the various people walking past could help, walking towards a scruffy-looking man who was the nearest person to me. I politely coughed and gave him a disarming smile. I may be a little SHT, especially with my suddenly acquired devil instincts telling me to just force the information out of him ringing in my head, but I was perfectly able to be respectful when necessary. The scruffy-looking man wore a black cloak with a weird goblet inside a half-moon. He looked at me dismissively. "Excuse me, could you tell Dash? F off," he grunted and turned back to his friend he was speaking to. I barely acknowledged when my fist raised and only realized what I was doing when my fist collided with his face, making a crunching sound as his body dropped like a sack of SHT on pavement. Blinking, I looked down. He was out cold with BLD coming out of his mouth. His friend looked admittedly just as shocked as I was. I had fully expected to get the SHT beaten out of me. I knew it was a stupid idea, but something flared up inside me. I had never experienced the brief flare of anger I had felt before. It had caught me off guard and made me lash out. SHT, was I a devil of wrath? Or maybe a devil of pride? My memories allowed me to learn about the 7 sins devils had. 7 sins. Greed, sloth, lust, pride, envy, gluttony, and finally wrath. Every devil normally matured into one of these sins, which gave them a power based on their sin and an increase in power the more they indulge in their allocated sin. Which in turn increased the random power they were given by it. This could also just be my devil instincts not allowing the disrespect by a human. I mentally corrected myself. I would have to get used to this whole devil thing, but for now, I ducked under the enraged fist of his friend. I'm guessing these guys weren't exactly strong or over level 1, since they went down pretty quickly. That could also just be my devil physiology. One practiced jab to the face sent him into the realm of Morpheus, with his friend laying beside him. I swiped the pouch on his belt before running like a madman away from the scene. Luckily, I'm pretty certain no one saw me. My enhanced physiology made me faster than I had ever been before. It was an hour later, I finally found the guild. Turns out that the guild had only been 10 buildings northwest from the Tower of Babel. Which was embarrassing that I had been so close to it earlier. The building itself was a relatively mundane-looking 3-story house with 3 multicolored banners. The guild was currently packed with people walking in and out, only comparable to the dungeon itself. After pausing for a few seconds to admire the building itself, I decided to make my way inside the guild building itself. I wondered if I could become an adventurer without being a part of a familia. It didn't matter if I couldn't since I would probably join one anyway. A free power-up on top of my supposed new devil physiology which made me a lot stronger than I was as a human, and wasn't that a surprise? I mean, I guess I should have expected it, but to think I was that strong now was pretty cool. I'm pretty sure the fauna given by gods only boosts what's there too, so that's a bonus. The thought of having supernatural strength when it was only yesterday I was sitting at home depressed was pretty unbelievable. I was still half expecting to wake up at some point, but I just went with it for now. I'm sure anyone else would be freaking out about leaving the life they had behind, but honestly, there wasn't much anyway. Plus, why complain about being given super strength and possibly magic? Strolling up to the register, a brown-haired man stood behind with a bored expression. He glanced up at me as I came to stand in front of him. He wore a set of black vest and pants with a white-collared long-sleeve shirt underneath and a gray bow tie. "Hello," I started, and he sighed as if he understood what I wanted from that alone. Grabbing a clipboard from under his desk. "Name?" "Zephyraion," I replied. He didn't bat an eye at my name, he probably didn't care. "Age?" 15. I was having a mad sense of déjà vu. Was the man from earlier and this guy related? They had that perfect, I want to do anything but this look. "Familiar?" he asked. "None." I replied somewhat nervously. "What?" He looked up. "None." I repeated. He looked like he was about to say something before he shook his head. He brought out another file and offered me a pen. "Sign this, it'll make sure that should the event of your death occur, the guild shall not be responsible for any death or injury sustained in the dungeon," he said, almost like he was trying to get me to reconsider by making it sound ominous. I happily signed it, much to his slight displeasure, and he nodded. "A guild advisor will be assigned to you shortly, please wait as we contact someone for you," he said monotonously. I watched as he walked away, presumably to go fetch me my new guild advisor. I sat down on a chair nearby, somewhat awkwardly, as people passed by me. Normally, I would pull out my phone, but I didn't have that luxury at this moment. Adventurers passed me in droves as I waited for 15 minutes. I was beginning to feel myself grow bored as I tapped my foot. Finally, after a few minutes, the man who had registered me came back. This time he was followed by an appealing woman with long red hair that went down to the bottom of her back. Cold yellow slitted eyes with two fluffy red ears that twitched ever so slightly. The red-haired beauty wore the same attire as the other man, whose name I never bothered to catch. The suit she wore hugged her curves in all the right places. Her aura was cold as she looked around with apathy. The wolf girl finally locked eyes with me and seemingly assessed me. I stood up as the man came to a stop in front of me. "This is your assigned advisor, rossweisse. If that's all, I will leave you two to get sorted," he said dismissively. He walked away before I could reply, and I frowned at his attitude. The wolf girl in front of me continued to stare with apathy in her eyes. "Continue staring at me like that, and I may just start blushing," I said with a grin. Finally breaking the ice as she didn't react to my words. "Follow me," she finally said and began walking away. We arrived in a secluded room which had two couches either side and a table in between. We both sat down and she grabbed a folder. I went to speak, but she cut me off. "No familia?" she questioned. "Yeah." Her eyes narrowed at me dangerously, so I decided to change the topic. "So, Rose, was it? Mind providing me some information on the dungeon?" I asked. "You haven't even done research on the dungeon?" she questioned almost maliciously. "Well, you should quit while you still can." She cut me off coldly, closing the folder with a snap. "I'll take my chances," I replied without missing a beat. I wasn't going to be scared off. I knew even with my enhanced devil genes I would need to be careful, and it wasn't like I planned to charge in without any worry for my well-being. I very much liked being alive. Another fool eager to throw their life away in the depths of the dungeon for glory and wealth. How pitiful. She said with the same apathetic tone. I felt myself grow annoyed at the dismissal she sent at me. I assure you I'm capable of going into the dungeon without a familia. I said. I didn't know where in terms of power I stood at since I was only aware I had somewhat super-enhanced genes, but if I could knock out an adventurer with a fauna then surely I could at least take on the first floor. Don't mistake luck for skill. The dungeon doesn't play favorites and it certainly doesn't show mercy. It isn't as simple as just killing monsters, she dismissed my statement. Why must you newbies be all the same? You think you're some invincible hero in the making setting out on an adventure until reality hits you like a ton of bricks, and at least those fools had the backing of a familia with a fauna. She continued with a tiny hint of annoyance, as if it were a preconceived notion that I would die. It made me quiet down a little bit as I understood, she must have had many others like me who had recklessly gone into the dungeon only to die. This was probably her way of coping after watching perhaps hundreds of adventurers under her watch die. Well, aren't you just a ray of sunshine, I couldn't help muttering, but by the way her ear twitched, I could bet she heard me. She shook her head and I saw a small amount of sadness flash in her eyes before it was crushed the next second. She handed me a folder with the basic information pertaining to the dungeon. If you wish, you may take a loan for basic LTHR gear and a basic iron sword. This will need to be paid back within the next year if you do take this path. She said robotically. I nodded, the meeting wasn't really notable after that, and I left after asking a few questions. I gave her a last look, I saw her hesitating before she shook her head almost sadly and her ears ever so slightly drooped. I couldn't blame her, but it wasn't like I was a normal case compared to a normal human. My strength was decent for someone who hadn't trained their body like at all. That did beg the question, whose familia did I want to join? I'm pretty sure that the strongest families belonged to Loki and Freya. Though I didn't know for sure. To be honest, I didn't really want to join them. Honestly, I didn't know why I was even asking. Would I rather be a mook in some powerful familia or have a hot, busty goddess all to myself? Do I even need to answer that question? Now if only I could find said aforementioned goddess anywhere, alas unfortunately it turns out there were quite a few churches around in Orario. I guess it couldn't hurt to ask around. Hestia POV. Strolling down a quiet street, Hestia's shoulders were slumped with disappointment. The multiple stories and tales she'd heard from Tenkai from other gods had painted a certain picture, of how amazing creating a familia was. Hestia had come down with a plan to find some children to give her blessing to and start the strongest familia. In reality, building one was challenging without any reputation, no one seemed interested in joining a familia deemed poor and weak. She'd been rejected by multiple people, and it stung a bit more than she would like to admit. She let out a defeated sigh as she got back from selling potato ball. Which hadn't been exactly what she had in mind when descending. Hephaestus had kicked her out after months of no progress, which she didn't blame her for. Hestia began to wonder if she was doing something wrong. Perhaps I need to be more cheerful. Hestia wondered idly, playing with a lock of her silky raven hair. So lost in her thoughts, she didn't even notice as she walked into someone. Stumbling, she squealed in panic as she felt herself falling over before a soft hand grabbed hers and pulled her up. Hestia blinked as she looked up into a pair of eyes that made her stare. Rainbow trapped in a pair of eyes that looked at her with a hint of familiarity. Bloody crimson hair framing a young, roguishly handsome face. A young man, seemingly in his mid-teens, stood at a relatively tall stature. Clad in a rather basic attire, his arms suggested he had a decently athletic build. He held her hand for a second as they both stared for a few awkward seconds. The young teen coughed into his hand and released her from his grip. Sorry about that, I wasn't paying attention. He apologized. Hestia regained her bearings and waved her hands up almost comically. No, "It's my fault I was lost in my thoughts," she squeaked. She flashed him an apologetic smile. Zephyrion POV. Staring into the sapphire blue eyes of Hestia, I had to admit one thing. The anime did not do her justice. With silky raven locks framing her cute heart-shaped face, her skin appeared to be flawless, the appealing smile she wore didn't help either. Her body had curves in all the right places, and two large orbs seemed poised to spill out from her top. Her long legs that were on display seemed to stretch for miles and added to the hourglass figure she had. Hestia was a beauty expected of a goddess. It seemed I had finally found her. I really hadn't been paying attention when I felt something soft hit my body and found the form of the goddess falling almost comically. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked kindly. She seemed tired. A difference I instantly noticed from the way she normally acted in the anime. There had been changes in the other world too. "You're Hestia, right? Heard around that you're looking for members for your familia?" I asked. She blinked before her eyes slowly began to widen and her eyes practically sparked with hope. Hestia made a cute sound that vaguely sounded like, "Huh. Yeah, I was looking to see if I could join." "You want to join my familia?" she questioned disbelievingly. Geez, just how strong had this woman been rejected? Could people really be this blind? Meh, their loss is my gain. Yeah. If you'll have me. I tilted my head as she hesitated. "Why?" she asked, looking thoroughly depressed. "Okay, what? Why wouldn't I want to join your familia? I'd rather have a loving goddess who cares about me compared to just being another guy joining a large familia," I replied. I don't know why I was being so soft with her since I was kind of a PP to be honest, but it just felt right at the moment. She nodded and regained her bright demeanor. Was it strange I felt oddly possessive after only meeting her like a few minutes ago? I'll chalk it up to these devil instincts I had gained. "Thank you, she paused. "Zephyrion, but feel free to call me Zeph," I said with a grin. "Zeph!" Hestia exclaimed energetically. She seemed to have gotten her enthusiasm back. Grabbing my hand she started pulling me along with her. I simply allowed myself to be dragged looking at her in amusement. I woke up with a yawn which came out muffled as my head seemed to be buried in a mound of softness or to be specific trapped in between two large mounds. Blinking, I attempted to move, only to realize my head was trapped by two delicate arms. I looked up to see the bottom of Hestia's flawless face which was currently sleeping peacefully. I could feel her breath gently tickling my hair as she kept me in a vice-like grip. She still wore the same attire which she had been wearing yesterday. A white Arabian-style dress. Feeling her curvy body hugging tight against mine and the fact she had her perfect legs wrapped around me, quickly made Junior wake up in search of a friend. Oh dear. I had forgotten about this side of the clingy goddess. Hand to heart we had gone to sleep on either side of the bed. Now I was being used as a body-sized pillow. It didn't help that her dress was so short that her panties were probably exposed right now. Other than that it was extremely comfortable. "Junior please, you're going to get me put on a certain naughty list if you continue." She moaned softly and I felt Junior begin preparing for battle. Gently, or trying to be gentle I had to use my devil strength to unwrap her arms around me. Slowly. Then I shuffled out of her soft embrace. Her perfect legs are almost trying to claw me back. The battle was strong fought. I eventually managed to roll out of bed. She instantly adopted a look of discomfort as the warm source of heat left her side. I took some time to sort through the memories of the original Zephyrion. I didn't really know how to feel about him. I had gained many of his memories but not the emotions with them I guess. He was a good kid, quiet and studious. An opposite to me but he was pretty smart from what I had gleaned. Luckily even though we were opposites his personality never fought against mine. I did sometimes find myself gaining a few of his personal attributes but they were only small things. An extra look at something here or the tapping of my foot when I got impatient. I also found myself getting flashbacks mostly with memories of two sisters both crimson-haired who adored me and of a certain lonely magical girl flashing in my mind. There were times when I had to go through and arrange all my memories. While I also suppressed my devil instincts, which wasn't too strong. I did feel a huge part of me was being tied down by something though. A part of me that was akin to a blizzard, raging to be let out. Which, as you could imagine, wasn't a nice feeling. It was good that I didn't find myself getting overwhelmed by the memories, since a lot of them were fuzzy and strong to remember. Though it was annoying when they seemingly randomly came to me, since it normally forced me into a bit of a daze. Sighing in relief, I walked into the kitchen. Checking the cabinets, I noticed a distinct lack of food. I looked around and there was nothing. Rubbing my head in annoyance, I checked the pouch I had liberated. I counted the valley and nodded. Yep, I had no clue how much that was. I was still trying to figure out how this currency worked. Judging by the amount of valley in my pouch, I estimated I had about 2,000 valley. Peeking back at the sleeping goddess, I decided I would go get us some food. Hopefully, I will have enough. If not, I'm sure some other people would be happy to donate to the cause. Walking out of the abandoned church, I began my technique of wandering around uselessly until I found a place that sells food. It took me a while of strolling around the large city of DanMachi before I stumbled onto different types of stalls all selling hot food. A man handing out flyers came over to me with the false friendly smile of a businessman. "Hello sir, are you interested in visiting the circus here in or dash?" I put my hand up. "Sorry, I'm saving myself for marriage," I said without missing a beat and walking past him. He stood there dumbfounded before walking off with a confused expression. I navigated through the many food stalls selling different foods amidst bustling crowds comprising various different races, with stall owners energetically calling out their products. This scene reminded me of medieval times depicted in stories and paintings. How exciting! I walked up to a bald man who was selling some sort of crushed potatoes. It looked hot and fresh, so why not? "Hello, sir." "Hello, mind telling me what you're selling?" I gestured to the food on his stall. "This is a jagamarukan, it's created by adding spices to crushed potatoes and fried after adding an outer skin," he informed me. Jagamarukan? Sounds like some shitty attack name from Boruto. "I'll take 10, I replied. "That'll be 300 valas please sir," he said as he prepared the jagamarukans. "Ah, good. I wouldn't need to liberate any more money from the confinement of undeserving pockets." I opened the pouch and froze when I heard a voice shout at me. Spinning around, I saw the guy from yesterday running towards me with his buddy. He didn't waste any time and swung. Dropping the pouch, I dodged and gave him an uppercut. The hit connected so perfectly that it almost seemed RTC the way he folded like a shitty gym chair and fell down. The second idiot failed to grasp the hint and swung a haymaker with such an obvious opening that it bordered on comical. I delivered a swift jab to his chin that sent him tumbling down onto his friend. I'm glad I took all those defense classes in my previous life. That was a good investment on my part. I was no ninja, but I knew how to fight. Apparently, these adventurers didn't know a single thing about melee fighting. Seriously, they would have been better off just swngng a sword around. Turning back, I looked at the intimidated stall owner. I picked up the pouch and took out the required valley. "Sorry about that. Ex-brother-in-law. The divorce was messy. Long story short, his sister now identifies as a lesbian. Apparently, no other man could satisfy her like I could," I casually said while I took my food. Stepping on the two guys sprawled across the pavement, I walked over them and made my way back to the abandoned church, somewhat in a hurry as that little fight had drawn a lot of attention. I sighed, now that this little adventure had come to an end. I better head back quickly so this food doesn't get cold. Scene break. Walking into the church with the still hot jagamarukans in hand, I went down a narrow staircase. heading straight for the kitchen and setting them down on the counter. Peeking into the main room, I noticed Hestia sitting on the couch. Taking a closer look, for some reason, she looked severely depressed, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Good morning," I called out, somewhat confused. I wasn't good with emotions. The goddess turned to me in shock and I noticed her eyes were slightly watery. I had no clue what was happening. She jumped up and flew into me like a missile. Then wrapped around me in a bear hug. Zeph. Looking down at the slightly emotional goddess, I was extremely confused. What am I supposed to do in this situation? Hesitantly, I stretched my right hand towards her head and gently began patting her silky hair which was done up into twin ponytails. "Where did you go?" she asked softly. I tilted my head down at her smaller form. "I noticed we didn't have any food, so I went to get some," I replied. "I thought yesterday had been a dream," she mumbled, and I winced in realization. She pulled back and beamed at me going right back to normal. She suddenly perked up then sniffed the air and looked puzzled. "Did you buy Jagamarukans?" she asked. I blinked. "Yeah, how did you know?" "Oh, I work at the stall that sells them. So I know how they smell," she said with an embarrassed look. I stared at her blankly. A goddess was working at some food stall. I vaguely remembered her working somewhere but a food stall. My knowledge of DanMachi was somewhat fuzzy but this was bullshit. "That's going to end, now that you have a familia member. Right?" I questioned. She shook her head with a grateful smile. "You don't need to look after me, Zeph. As your goddess, I need to make enough money for us, so you can focus on getting equipment," she said with a smile of appreciation at my concern. "No, that isn't needed. I'm sure I can make enough for the both of us. If not, I'll just go deeper into the dungeon until I can," I replied with a shrug. With my enhanced devil physique I was going to become much stronger than everyone else. It's not like I didn't plan to exercise either. Seriously, the Falno was a useful tool no doubt, but it still was just that, a tool. I don't know why adventurers rely on it as some sort of lifeline to focus on. It was a bit pathetic in my opinion. Perhaps it is just me having a different perspective due to being an outsider. As someone who's had no opportunity to wield any sort of power all his life, I wasn't going to miss this opportunity. Maybe it was my devil instinct but that line of thought made me shiver with excitement. The thought of strength was almost intoxicating. I sighed, my race is so up. No. I won't be a useless goddess and force you to risk more just because we have no money at the moment, she declared with her cheeks puffed out. I narrowed my eyes and she crossed her arms, pouting cutely back at me. "My sweet goddess, don't go and force me to do something drastic now. It's unbecoming for you to work at some food stall selling to humans," I replied and smiled charmingly. I don't know why it irked me so much. Technically, I had only known her for a day, but still. The curvy goddess of the hearth looked at me in defiance. I sighed. Scene break. Turns out that Hestia could be extremely stubborn when it came down to what she perceived as being a burden. It did however reaffirm that I had made the right choice in joining her familia. I would have started throwing hands if some god tried to treat me like a SLV. Power can be acquired in time, but loyalty was a harder thing to come by right off the bat. She had known me for only a day, yet she already felt protective of what she referred to as her first child. It was a new experience being cared for and treated decently by someone else. I even enjoyed it. Now here I stood in front of a simple-looking bookstore, which was where Hestia had insisted on giving me her blessing. Apparently, she had a hobby for reading and this was her favorite bookstore. We entered the bookshop and made our way to a quote section inside. The whole place was quiet and had little to no people wandering around, so it wasn't strong to find a quiet spot. The bookstore was more like a library at this point. Now what? I questioned. She turned to me and she seemed to be practically vibrating in excitement. "Take off your shirt and just lay down on the couch and let me do the rest," she squealed in excitement. I smirked deviously and took off my shirt, exposing my torso to Hestia. Her eyes widened at my forming six-pack and I nodded. "Zeus ain't got SHT on me." Lying face down on the LTHR couch, I felt Hestia's surprisingly light form straddle my back just a moment later. I purposefully ignored the way her soft thighs melded against my back. "I'm glad I'm lying down." I felt Hestia shuffle a bit before she paused. "Hey, Zeph." "Yeah?" I asked, a bit confused. "Are you sure you want to join me of all the gods?" she asked, sounding oddly hesitant and a bit pained. "Why do you ask?" I questioned back. I had noticed that Hestia seemed to be depressed when the subject came up. Has it been that strong for her to recruit anybody? It's just. There are so many options out there that could provide you with a better support base for going into the dungeon. More resources, a better place to live. "I just don't want you to regret throwing your lot in with me," she replied, her tone filled with anxiety and a bit of self-deprecation. Ah, she really was too sweet. It confused me why others couldn't see this. It's rather simple. I'm greedy. I don't see why I should bother joining some other giant familia as another nobody whose god or goddess barely cares about them and treats them like SHT. When I can have you, all to myself. I replied with a shrug. I hadn't been a good person before. Now with the emergence of my new memories from a life I didn't live, coupled with my increasingly potent devil instincts. I certainly wasn't one now. She stayed silent before hugging my back. "Well, if that's what you want. Who am I to deny my first child?" she said with a giggle. Even as I felt something wet come from the face buried in my back. I felt Hestia move again before something wet hit my back, tilting my head. I saw Hestia with her finger dripping some golden BLD onto my back. The goddess muttered something and a surge of light enveloped my body. Every muscle in my body tensed before gradually relaxing. That was a strange feeling. My entire body felt vitalized with energy and I felt even more excited. I could still feel Hestia tracing my back as she seemingly read my newly gained fauna and I waited patiently for her to finish. Then Hestia froze. I glanced up and saw an expression of shock plastered on her face. Hestia POV. Staring down at Zeph's fauna, Hestia looked at the skill with disbelief. The process had gone exactly how she had been told it would. Zeph's status looked exactly like an adventurer who gained a new fauna should. Normal. That still held true until she had a look at the skill section. The ability to manipulate the chaotic energy of demonic beings, otherwise known as demonic energy. Imagination magic. The ability to create magic via imagination, cost is dependent on magic conjured. Power of destruction, mutated, sealed. All speak. The ability to communicate with any being regardless of language. User can communicate via any language. Hesita couldn't believe her eyes. She even rubbed them clear and briefly wondered if she was hallucinating. She had never heard of such outrageous skills existing. The goddess didn't fully grasp the concept of demonic energy manipulation, as she had never heard of such an energy, but she could hazard a few guesses. Hestia was aware of the concept of demons, although to her knowledge they didn't exist. She would have to ask him about it. Then there was also this imagination magic, which to her was perhaps the most insane out of all his other skills. The ability to conjure up magic via imagination. It basically spat on every other mage in Orario. She had no clue why his other skill was sealed. Closing her eyes, she expanded her senses and made sure not to touch her arcanum, and she felt it in his body. Something wrapped up in chains made of a strange chaotic energy. Hestia had a very clear guess as to what the power entailed by its name, and the implications of it were mind-boggling. Then there was the skill of all speak. While it may not seem impressive, the ability to communicate through any language was definitely useful and unheard of. Hestia would admit she wasn't experienced at all with running a familia. Yet she was pretty certain that it was extremely rare for any child to gain a single skill upon activation of a fauna. Much less 4. Though surprised as she was, the smile that lit up her face as she read through couldn't be denied. Hestia felt extremely blessed to have such a special first child in her familia. The wait was worth it. Hestia squealed in her mind. Zeph? She asked, calming herself down. Which for the energetic goddess was no small feat. How come you have 4 different abilities? All outrageously powerful. I'm assuming it isn't just because of the fauna? She asked surprisingly calmly. Zeph appeared confused at first, but then his eyes widened in realization as if he had remembered something he had forgotten. He flashed me a cocky smile. I'm glad you asked, my dear goddess. The answer must be because I ate my veggies when I was younger. My father always said they would make me strong. He replied proudly. Hestia stared at him flatly. Why does it say here you can control demonic energy? She asked more inquisitively. He looked a bit bashful. This is going to take a while to explain. He said, looking thoughtful. Zephyrion POV. It was embarrassing to admit, but I had forgotten about my ability to manipulate demonic energy and use imagination magic. It had been at the back of my mind since coming here. Now, I watched the joyful goddess gush over me and glanced back down at the paper displaying my status. I remembered now. My power of destruction that had been sealed was something I had known about. When I was younger, my power of destruction had mutated and become uncontrollable or something like that. So my family had planned to wait for me to get a better grasp on my demonic power before unsealing it. Troublesome, I would have to see about getting that unsealed soon. Luckily Hestia didn't seem put off by the fact I was a devil, and instead, she seemed thrilled to have her first child be so unique. I was somewhat surprised that she didn't seem to mind me being essentially a devil noble, but I suppose that's one reason why I selected her as my chosen goddess. After a while of talking we both walked out of the bookstore. Tossing her the pouch that had been so gracefully given to me, I flashed her a grin as she looked confused. That should have about 1,700 valley inside. Go buy yourself something nice. I'm going to go check out the dungeon. I explained, and her eyes widened. She gave me a beaming smile. Thanks, Zeph. She exclaimed and jumped up to wrap me in a hug before adding. Make sure to be careful, I don't want you to get hurt. Don't worry, I'll be careful, I reassured her, and she nodded. We both departed as Hestia went to presumably go buy some things with the limited amount of valley I gave her. I would need to get some more for her. Having only one pair of clothing as a goddess should be considered a crime. Didn't that redhead goddess kick her out at some point? I would need to have some words with her. She could have, at least as Hestia's best friend, provided some spare clothing for her. I made my way over to the Adventurers Guild, so I could get some basic equipment loaned to me. I wasn't all that bothered about paying it back since I was sure I could make whatever it costs pretty easily. Through dungeon diving or liberating it from the scum of Orario was left unknown for now. Coming into view of a rather familiar building, I strode inside and awaited my joyful guild advisor. Rose came out in all her cold glory, simply walking past me and expecting me to follow. Rolling my eyes, I got up from the seat I was lounging on and followed her inside the small comfortable room. So, I don't suppose you've finally come to your senses and have decided to resign your registration within the guild? She instantly questioned in that icy apathetic tone. Nope, I'm here to get my starter armor, I replied without missing a beat. Rose stared for a few seconds before almost robotically getting up and going over to a set of drawers, pulling out a piece of paper which I assumed was a contract. She sat back down in front of me. Silently she tossed the piece of paper onto the table in front of us and I picked it up. Scanning through the document, it was a legal document declaring I would pay back what was owed within the year. Do you have a pen? I asked her, glancing up at Rose, who was quietly observing me. Without a word, she tossed me a pen with surprising accuracy. I caught it and quickly signed the document. I used my signature from my old world since my other half had never bothered forming one. Then I handed it back to her. A small, humorless sigh escaped her lips. You can go and request the starter package at the main desk, they'll provide you with the armor and basic weaponry. Is there anything else? Rose asked in a monotone. I don't suppose I could have some information on what to suspect in the dungeon? I asked. It was probably best I get an idea of what monsters I should look out for. While I was confident in my ability to handle the first few floors with my enhanced devil physiology, which placed me above any normal level 1 adventurers, especially with the passive enhancement the fauna now gave me, I didn't want to be killed for my arrogance. Rose had a brief look of relief flash on her face. It was almost wiped off before I could have noticed it, if not for my devil physique. She pulled out a leaflet of sorts and handed it to me. So she does care. This has the information needed for dealing with the monsters all the way down to floor 5. Read it carefully. She stated sharply. Taking a quick look through it, I saw various depictions of monsters with abilities and weaknesses. Why only the top 5, can't I have the information on the rest? I asked while reading through the leaflet's contents. Goblins are mostly seen on floors 1 to 4 and 8 to 9. They are known widely as the weakest monsters in the dungeon. With no unique skills or any racial traits that can be used as weapons, the only thing to look out for is their intelligence. In a 1-to-1 fight you can expect them to try to use their fists or dull nails to defeat or harm you. Goblins have been known to use their intelligence to sometimes form groups in an attempt to overwhelm an adventurer. The guild suggested that any adventurers make sure to keep an awareness of any other goblins nearby, or in rare cases a basic ambush. Goblins also held a chance of dropping a goblin fawn which could be sold to the guild. This was the type of information I received as I checked the first and second floor monsters. There's no point, you'll probably get yourself killed before you reach that point regardless. She replied brutally. That wasn't helpful. I rolled my eyes at her attitude and didn't bother answering. It was pointless at the end of the day. She should try find another job if she had it out for adventurers this much. Rose Bennett. Staring as the foolish crimson-haired teenager at was named Zephirion Gremory flipped through the standard starter leaflet I had provided him with, she can't help but feel annoyed. I had failed again to push another foolish child off the path of being an adventurer which led them to their death. Why no one but her could see this path had no end she was unsure of. Many called me rude names behind my back, thinking I couldn't hear them. They complained and didn't heed my warnings, they called me a harsh beach or an uncaring were. Yet, it was completely the opposite. Despite the way I acted, the only reason I kept working as a guild advisor was to turn people away. To scare them if the need arose. Unlike many of those who had quit and been replaced with the younger guild staff who always told me to try to brighten up and ridicule me for the way I act. I had seen how many of those died. I had once been one of the young guild advisors trying my best to help. I had some powerful and weak adventurers in my time, but they mostly shared the same fate. They got cocky and traveled further down than they should. Each death added another layer to my hardened exterior. I lost count of how many lives had shaped me into this person. Was it after the 100th death? Witnessing the demise of countless individuals, each with their own personality, left a mark of pain and sadness on me. Which was why I pushed all of them away from me, it was easier that way. When they died it didn't hurt as much. Unclenching my fists which had been unconsciously balled up, I let my emotions dull under the layer of apathy. A useful technique I had picked up and simply waited for him to finish reading. Hopefully when he fought the monsters and realized it wasn't like the fairy tales displayed it, he would abandon this foolish path to death. I refused to give him any more info on monsters above floor 5. Hoping that the limitation would make him keep to the lower floors. witnessing firsthand how adventurers assumed knowing what attacks a creature had equated to being able to deal with them. It's better for him to learn how easy it is to find yourself overwhelmed with weaker foes so he may escape rather than to charge recklessly into a higher floor. Zephyrion finished reading and bid me farewell, which I didn't bother replying to. He would either save himself or end up perishing like the others. Hopefully he lives a while longer so I can try to convince him out of this foolish path like the others, I advise. Zephyrion. Looking around in interest, I let out a hum. It was quieter than I expected, almost eerily so. There were random rocks scattered around and a few marks on the wall, presumably from fighting, yet so far it was pretty barren. So this is the first floor of the infamous dungeon. I idly commented aloud. Gripping the basic iron sword that had come along with the starter gear I loaned, I began walking around the labyrinth of hallways and rooms. Anyone home? I raised my voice and listened to the small echo it created. This is your delivery order, you ordered some tampons. I shouted. A rock was very gently kicked aside and I grinned, turning to the ugly short-looking bug-eyed F-er glaring at me. The goblin, who looked ready to charge, abruptly paused and began sniffing the air towards me. The goblin's ugly head tilted as if it was unsure. Indecision flashed in its beady large eyes. Its head briefly lowered before its eyes flashed red and it suddenly screeched. The goblin charged at me with vicious rage. Pushing the weird event that had occurred moments before, I charged right back, holding the sword amateurishly in my hand. Its claw swiped at me, to which I simply swung my sword upwards at. The goblin screeched in pain and stumbled back, its arm had been nearly severed off. It hung limply bare, held together by his side. I simply swung the sword again with one arm. I winced as the sword cut straight across its head at an odd angle. The sword itself got stuck in its head before the goblin stiffened and fell over. Alrighty then, if the leaflet is correct, I need to dig out the crystal inside the goblin next. Yanking out the iron sword from its skull, I use it to cut into the goblin's stomach. I dig around inside the corpse and finally pull out some weird stone. The itself body suddenly turned into black dust as the stone left its body. That wasn't that strong. Holding the strange crystal it left behind, I stored it in my pocket. So this was a magic stone, interesting. I really should have taken a bag with me to store these things with. A screech came from down the hall which the goblin had previously come from, and suddenly two more goblins appeared. They both simultaneously had the same strange reaction. Backing away and looking at me with confusion. It was kind of freaky the way they screeched and charged at you. I guess this is a better time than any other to try out my magic. I had only been tutored on imagination magic and hadn't been allowed to use it alone. Meaning I had only learned how to create basic elemental spells for now. I still hadn't gotten a magic circle because they worried I would use magic out of tutoring before I had properly gotten it down. In face, I had been reprimanded a couple of times for experimenting with it outside of tutoring. Guess I'll have to improvise. Thankfully, I'd like to believe my imagination is halfway decent. I imagined a ball of swirling condensed fire. The way it would burn my skin if it touched and burn the air around it, the ashes it would leave my enemies in. Supply, I pushed the raging energy towards where I wanted the ball to form. I willed it into the swirling ball of fire and heat began to expand out from my palm. I grinned and opened my eyes, only to gawk. A large ball of fire swirled chaotically, regaining my composure as I saw the screeching goblins realize they may be F. The ball shot forwards with surprising speed. I let out a gasp as I felt my demonic energy plummet from that alone. Holy SHT, the ball vaporized the two goblins before continuing behind them. Oh, that's not good. An explosion tore outwards at the end of the large hall and caused smoke to billow outwards. Regaining my breath from the massive loss of demonic energy, I was a bit stumped before I remembered. Right, magic circles. I remembered in my research for demonic magic that imagination magic was extremely expensive, which was why we used magic circles. This cost could decrease a lot with more mastery over demonic energy as well. That's annoying. I would have to look into other ways of using magic while I gain more control of my demonic energy, I suppose. My demonic energy reserves weren't exactly small, it hadn't taken all my demonic energy, but it took much more than I could handle simply using continuously at the moment. Still. I grinned. Being able to use magic was awesome for both parts of me. I guess I should try to find the limitations of this and experiment a bit. I wouldn't be able to use it much till I found a better alternative, but that wouldn't stop me. Though, looking back at the large amount of smoke coming my way, I should probably go to a different part of the dungeon first. Jack. At the entrance to the dungeon a commotion was taking place as adventurers could be seen exiting the dungeon by the hundreds. All the adventurers stuck in their respective groups and seemed to be muttering to each other in hushed tones. Powerful adventurers could be seen entering through the entrance, while guild members stood outside asking everyone to stop entering for the moment. This unusual sight sparked curiosity among onlookers, who wondered what was happening. The guild typically refrained from intervening in dungeon matters, and even now, they could only request that adventurers stay out, as they had no control over the dungeon itself. Rumors appeared and were spread around until the guild released a statement. Jack walked up to one of his friends who stood off to the side. He had come after hearing weird rumors about the dungeon, apparently the guild were trying to get adventurers not to enter due to something happening inside. "Hey Rayon, what's going on?" Jack asked as he arrived beside his friend. Rayon turned to him. "Oh, you haven't heard? Apparently there's been a dungeon flood on the first 4 floors." He replied. Jack's eyes widened. A dungeon flood was when monsters suddenly appeared in outrageous numbers. The thing is, these circumstances where a dungeon flood even happens were extremely rare. What was even rarer was these dungeon floods had only normally happened on the lower floors. It was pretty much unheard of for it to happen on the starter floors, and even more dangerous for the newbies who didn't know how to handle it. Especially since that led to spillage, which at lower levels was fatal for lower-level adventurers. Spillage was the term used when a dungeon flood began spilling into the higher floors which caused the death of many aspiring adventurers. Yeah, I had that same reaction. They've sent stronger adventurers to go clear it out and search for anybody who was still down there. Since everyone on those floors would be newbies, there's bound to be some death. SHT, do they know why it happened? Jack asked. Rayon shook his head in denial. We still don't know why dungeon floods happen, only that they're pretty rare. I guess whatever triggered it this time must be on one of the 3 floors. It's the first time a dungeon flood has happened under floor 7. Now that was a true shitshow. Rayon muttered with a head shake. Jack noticed adventurers who looked new limping out with terrified expressions. They spotted cuts all over them and were immediately attended to by healers. Meanwhile, Zephyrin. I wonder if Orario has a burger place. I idly thought as I cut through another goblin. They were starting to come in higher numbers now. A burger sounds real good right now. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 2. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Totallynotsnipez on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.